I will be presenting on Chapter 2 of The Responsible Administrator, Understanding Ethical Decision Making. The chapter presents a series of steps you might employ in thinking about ethical issues you confront. As we encounter ethical problems in our positions as public administrators, we can view these as opportunities to develop and refine a working theory of ethical conduct. The goal is that we become so familiar with the skills needed to resolve situations that these skills become habit. Since this chapter is on the topic of ethical decision making, we start off with a few examples of ethical dilemmas. In the blue circle, a clerk has been falsifying the payroll account by continuing to carry the names of laid-off employees. He's also been keeping the money from their cash checks. Yellow circle. Linda, who is in charge of studying an insecticide used in agriculture and whether it should be removed from the market, has also been on several dates with a man named George. She just found out that George is a Washington representative for the insecticide manufacturer. Moving on to the green circle. Your spouse works for a contractor that provides support services to your organization. Under normal circumstances, there is no conflict of interest. However, you learn that your organization will terminate the contract in the near future. Since it is a small company, this will probably result in layoffs. If you tell your spouse in order to give him time to plan for a layoff, he will probably feel an obligation to tell his boss and his fellow coworkers. Lastly, in red, you realize that a soil bacterium probably caused the death of a man who was swimming in a public pool owned by your company. Your company isn't taking full responsibility. They are saying that the level of risk is low and the pool should continue to be open. From the examples on the last slide, we recognize that ethical issues arise in many forms and raise difficult questions of administrative responsibility. Through our careers as administrators, we will develop an operational ethic by virtue of having made decisions about ethical issues time and time again. This operational ethic, which we exhibit through decision making, becomes the substance of one's professional character. It also creates a predisposition to behave in certain ways. Even a decision to ignore a problem is in fact a decision. At this point, you might be asking, what about an organization's code of conduct? Many organizations adopt codes of conduct. These are official statements. They're often presenting very noble and abstract principles, and they are indeed useful. But they never get to the level of internal ethical development in the day-to-day activity and decision-making of the individuals in the organization. A code of conduct doesn't help much when it comes to the skill of addressing ethical issues. Instead, what is most important is that we recognize the importance of resolving these issues and know that we can cultivate the skills needed. Ethical decision-making is an ongoing process of designing the best course of action. It requires a framework because it is a dynamic process. Henry David Aiken constructed a framework for explaining the fluid nature of ethical arguments. From Aiken's perspective, it is possible to identify 4 distinct levels at which we deal with ethical concerns. Starting at the bottom of the slide, the expressive level. Have you ever vented to one of your coworkers about how you were feeling or a problem that you were having in the office? Upon hearing the ethical dilemma situations in the slides before, how did you feel about the clerk who was stealing money from the company? How did you feel about the potential of one of your relatives swimming in a contaminated pool? Your initial thoughts often come out unfiltered, uncensored, and a little bit harsh. For example, you might think, we must have a bunch of morons handling this situation. These statements are spontaneous, they're unreflective, and they neither invite a reply nor attempt to persuade others. After our initial spontaneous expressions of emotion in the expressive level, we move on to the moral rules level. We address the problem of appropriate conduct and begin to assess alternatives and consequences. In the situation between Linda and George, we might consider these alternatives. Order Linda to stop seeing George, discuss the matter with your superior, or trust Linda to do the job without being biased by the relationship. We'll also consider the consequences. Linda may resign, the media may pick up the story, or you might be blamed for irresponsible conduct if your superior discovers the relationship without being informed by you. As you evaluate the alternatives and their possible consequences, various moral rules will come to mind. Examples of moral rules include what goes around comes around, truth will win out, take care of number one. We acquire these through our families, religious affiliations, education, professional experiences as well. They provide rules of thumb for appraising a situation and deciding what ought to be done. For the example between Linda and George, you might think, honesty is the best policy. If you take any action that Linda perceives as punishment or distrust, are you discouraging honest communication from your staff? Should you tell your boss, or should you maintain Linda's confidence and accept responsibility for dealing with the situation yourself? Most of the time, the problem is resolved at this level. We review the facts of the case, the alternatives for action, and their likely consequences, and we associate them with the moral rules that we have in our stock. The field of alternatives begins to narrow, and one or two rules emerge as crucial. We move towards a decision with the practical consequence and the moral justification, related in some way that is acceptable to us. Most ethical problems are solved in the moral rules level. However, on occasion we are driven to the ethical analysis level. When an issue is unique, complex, or profound in its consequences, we may need to re-examine the ethical principles in our norms for conduct. If we go back to honesty as the best policy, here we might examine the general principle and its meaning for conduct by developing more specific statements for a situation. A more specific statement might look like this: always tell the truth unless innocent third parties might be harmed. If we go back to our ethical dilemma of the contaminated pool, this situation might cause you to clarify and reorder your priorities. Yes, you have a loyalty to your organization's hierarchy and to respect your boss, but you also have a loyalty to the public. Confronted with this kind of dilemma, you begin to reflect on the things you value most. You ask yourself what you are willing to risk and what you want to preserve at all costs. You think about your personal integrity, professional reputation, financial security, and well-being of your family, your career, also the public. You wonder what you owe the public. You consider your duty to the local elected officials. You clarify and reorder your priorities. You weigh what is most important to you to help you make the best decision. We seldom reach the post-ethical level. But if you're pushed by a particularly disillusioning experience or confronting a profound personal crisis, you might find yourself here. The questions that you present yourself question your worldview, views of human nature, and the meaning of life. Why should I be moral? Why is truth important? Why should I care about the public? These are all examples of questions that might arise in the post-ethical level. This four-tiered framework is dynamic. Only in books do we move logically through the decision-making steps one by one. In real life, there are constraints of time and context. Sometimes we don't typically have the information all at once. The situation becomes more complex as new information is added. All of this might force us to move back a level or skip a level. Movement through the levels is not a conscious choice. We move through the levels naturally as we consider our values, morals, feelings, recognize the consequences, etc. In our day-to-day decision-making, we often don't allow time for reflective thought. But the intention of this book and this chapter is to make this process more conscious, so that we approach ethical issues systematically, so that we become more responsible in our work and form the habit of addressing such issues. Self-awareness is key to realizing the basis for our actions. In addressing ethical issues, we want to move from recognizing a problem to designing a course of action that will resolve it. This movement involves both description and prescription. We describe to ourselves and sometimes to others what we believe to be the objective state of affairs, and then attempt to prescribe what specific steps should be taken to change the situation. Figure 2.1 on page 30 shows the steps between description and prescription. The model represents a framework for arriving at a judgment and then deciding what to do. This model, and all models, can't lead us to the one best possible correct solution, but it can provide a template for creatively designing the best solutions for a given individual in a specific situation within the uncertainties and time limits of real administrative life. In the prescribed ethical decision-making model, we must first describe the situation. We must push past the expressive level and get to the true facts of what happened. Who was involved, the viewpoints of each of them, the issues, the sequence of events, and the risks. Whether we are struggling with a decision alone or discussing it with someone else, we must force ourselves to describe the situation in terms beyond our gut reaction to it. If we are to deal with real people involved in real events, we must first face, to the best of our ability, what has actually happened. Next, we need to define the ethical issue. The tendency here is to define the problem in practical rather than ethical terms. Considering the situation with a contaminated pool, you might define it practically as the problem of keeping one's boss happy or not offending the hierarchical structure of your organization. This is a definition of the practical dilemma, but behind these practical considerations are some conflicting values and principles that need to be identified. There's an ethical dilemma to be defined by reference to certain specific conflicting or competing ethical principles. Perhaps we consider conflicting loyalties. Or we can go a step further and consider obligations. The employee has an obligation to our organization, but also an obligation to the public. With the ethical issue defined, we are ready to move on to identifying alternatives. The inclination to view the alternatives in dichotomous terms must be avoided. For example, either you tell Linda to stop seeing George, or you trust her to handle the relationship in a professional manner. You tell your spouse about the possible contract termination, or you remain silent. This either-or view is the most common trap in the ethical process. Rarely does an ethical issue have only 2 or 3 possible solutions. The best situation here is to brainstorm. Allow yourself to just freely write down all of the possible alternatives. When you're brainstorming, you don't really give things much thought. You just stream of consciousness, write things down, and that will allow you to brainstorm several alternatives and not just stick with the 1 or 2 that come to your mind quickly. Once we have brainstormed a list of alternatives, We now look at the positive and negative anticipated consequences of each possible course of action. For example, if you tell Linda to stop seeing George, what is the likely outcome? What if you transfer her to another position? Ask another member of the staff to work along with her. Tighten your supervision of her work. In every alternative, what chain of events will likely unfold? Projecting the consequences of alternatives is a key dynamic in our natural informal decision-making. As we consider what we should do, we usually run a movie in our minds of what will happen. Here we are attempting to raise this informal process to a more formal, conscious, and systemic level. Lastly, in our model, we find a fit among the 4 elements in the circle. What moral rules can be adduced to support each alternative and the projected consequences? Rehearsal of defenses. Imagine that you are defending this alternative to a broad audience. This is the test of how well a particular alternative will fit with the accepted norms of the wider professional and political communities of which we are a part. Not only must this alternative fit your ethical principles, but also must fit those of the society. If we go back to making a movie of the alternatives and their consequences, think about yourself in that movie. After you reach this conclusion, how will you feel? Are you proud of the way you handled the situation, or do you have regret? All of these can be used to help you to find the best fit for the situation at hand. Let's discuss why we use this model. Obviously, no practicing administrator could be expected to apply this model to every ethical issue. However, if this model is used with the more significant problems, administrators will cultivate a habit of decision-making processes. Also, when we become aware of our own values and the external obligations under which we act, we achieve a greater degree of ethical autonomy. Without this model, we will naturally go to the most obvious courses of action. The model helps us to systematically and aggressively widen the range of conceivable options and assess how they fit both rationally and emotionally with our value system. Lastly, using this model requires self-awareness, self-control, and decision-making flexibility, which all strengthen our character. In this chapter, we first looked at a few ethical dilemmas. We explored the 4 levels of reflection in the 4-tiered framework. A descriptive model of ethical decision-making was outlined as the way people typically make ethical decisions. And we concluded with a review of a prescriptive decision-making model that may be used to systematically and self-consciously move from the description of an ethical problem to prescribed courses of action and organizational analysis. I leave you here with these discussion questions and look forward to the discussion that follows.